Okay, well, I'm glad to hear it. Tudo bem?
Good morning. Before we get going, I guess anybody who needs translation assistance or equipment and does not have it should raise their hand and it will be brought to you. I see a few hands. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Mike Van Dusen. I'm the Woodrow Wilson Center's Deputy Director, representing Lee Hamilton, Center's president this morning. Lee wanted to be here this morning but was called to a meeting with, I guess, the Obama people is the way to put it. He fully expects to stop by to see you at some point during the day. On Lee's behalf and on behalf of the Brazil Institute, I would like to welcome you this morning to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Today's conference on the future of U.S.-Brazilian relations is co-sponsored by the State Department's Fulbright Commission. It is a particular pleasure to welcome Brazil's ambassador to the United States, Antonio Patriota, and the United States ambassador to Brazil, Clifford Sobel, both of whom honor us with their presence here, and they will help us open this important conference on the future of U.S.-Brazilian relations as the Obama administration prepares to take office in Washington next month. We are also honored to welcome several important dignitaries from Brazil. The Minister of Defense, Nelson Jobim, is here. Governor Blairo Maggi of the state of Mato Grosso, and the Deputy Minister of Mines and Energy, Marcio Zimmerman, is here. Professor Antonio Barros de Castro, Special Advisor to the President of Brazil's National Bank of Development, and Ambassador Marcel Biato, the number two at the Brazilian equivalent of the National Security Council. It is also a pleasure to welcome, I don't see him in the audience yet, Ambassador Tom Pickering, a long-standing friend of the Wilson Center. Tom Pickering will participate with Ambassador Jobim in the first panel, which will be moderated by another good friend of the Brazil Institute and the Wilson Center, Kelly Myman from McClarty Associates. I should also recognize Brigadier General David Faddock, who is with us today representing Admiral James Stavridis, the commander of the United States Southern Command. Four former United States ambassadors, three former ambassadors to Brazil, Tony Motley, John Danilovich, and Tony Harrington, are here, and a fourth ambassador to the region and a former Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, Alec Watson's, are here. They're all good friends, and we welcome them to the center. Ambassador Harrington co-chairs the Advisory Council of the Brazil Institute with Alcoa Chairman Alain Belda. At the Wilson Center, we view our scholars and residents as a cornerstone of the institution. We are delighted to welcome today Dr. Leslie Bethel, a historian of Brazil who is now starting a 3-month period of residency at the Wilson Center as a public policy scholar. Finally, a warm welcome back to Washington for Ambassador Ruben Barbosa. Ambassador Barbosa served with distinction in this town, and during his tour here, he played a major role in the creation of a Brazil project at the Wilson Center. In mid-2006, the Brazil project became the Brazil Institute. Over the past 2 years, the Institute has established itself under the strong and creative leadership of Paulo Sotero, assisted by Alan Wright, as a source of knowledge and informed debate on key issues of bilateral and regional concern between Brazil and the United States. The Institute seeks to advance research on and discussion of Brazilian policies to those interested in Brazil's ascendance on the global scene. Today's conference is very much in the Wilsonian tradition. We have the right people in the room to discuss a critical foreign policy relationship. It's a good example of the quality of the Institute's programming, which aims to advance Washington's understanding of contemporary Brazilian realities and to enrich the dialogue between our two countries, the hemisphere's most populous and multiracial democracies with much in common. So a hearty welcome to everyone. You should all know you are always welcome at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I also remind our guests that today's event will end later this afternoon with a reception on the 4th floor of the Wilson Center's facility to mark the opening of a photo exhibit entitled Visual Impressions, which celebrates 50 years of the Fulbright program in Brazil, an exhibit that has been seen around the country during the course of 2008. I would like now to give the floor to Ambassador Sobel and Patriota, who will open the proceedings. Welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Want to go first? Please. You were named first.
I'll be glad to. First of all, good morning, bon dia. I'd like to also recognize someone who came with us yesterday from Brazil, the general who's in charge of the Army of Brazil, General Enzo, who's here as well. So I'd like to welcome you to our capital here in Washington. It's a great privilege for me to be here this morning, and I want to thank the Wilson Institute for putting together this important session at a very timely moment. Wilson, as you all know, is a leading institution that promotes the study and debate of issues facing the global community, and it's great today to be focused on Brazil, an important friend and partner of the United States. Ambassador Patriota has been a good friend since the very beginning when he was the Undersecretary responsible for affairs of North America, and it's a great privilege today for me to be sharing the platform once again with him. I look forward to doing many things in the future together, as we're doing this morning. We share a common mission, and that is to build the bridges and create the partnerships between our two countries. Indeed, the partnership between the United States and Brazil has never been stronger, and I believe there are boundless opportunities to deepen our bilateral, regional, and global efforts. I recall a speech I recently made in Brazil, given before the present market turmoil, but it is as relevant today as it was only a few months ago. The remarks was how Brazil could be the best of the BRICS. I found in doing research on the BRICS that there was a follow-up study. Goldman last year did a study that was titled Dreaming with the BRICS, the Path to 2050. And the results were quite startling. In fact, Goldman speculated that on the current trajectory, within 40 years, only 2 of the 6 G6 nations will still be part of the G6, Japan and the United States. And in fact, the other members of the G6 will be Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS. So the question is, how does the United States work with the leading countries in the developing world, specifically Brazil? What are our opportunities for partnership in the future? And how do we make our relationship broader and deeper? After World War II, the United States and its allies formed a new world order. Today, especially given the financial crisis that we're faced with, it is up to the developed world and the BRICS to do it once again. Whether the group is called G13, G20, it's important that we work ever closer together. Today, no one region, no country has the resources or the intellectual capital to deal with all of the issues that confront us. There is no monopoly on wisdom or creativity. And today, more than ever, Brazil and the United States are natural partners, not just because we are anchors of the North and South of the Western Hemisphere, but because Brazil increasingly has become a global leader. Only last week, I gave a speech to a group of children at the American School in Rio, and I found it fascinating, one of the questions that was asked from the children of the American School. I asked them to stand up when they asked their questions, and I asked them to tell me their passport, what country they're from. And a Brazilian stood up and said to me, "What is the United States going to do to help Brazil collect the money owed to it by Ecuador?" I will tell you, after being an ambassador for almost 8 years, Going to universities and schools are always quite an event. Of course, my answer to them was, I am sure Brazil can handle that issue by itself. But obviously, that is an issue that the United States is not unacquainted with. Brazil and the United States are the two largest democracies, we hear that often, in the hemisphere. We are both lands of immigrants. We are both melting pots. We are both continent-sized nations. But we are also two of the largest food producers of the world. Brazil will be one of the largest producers of energy, especially given its recent pre-salt discoveries, as is the United States, one of the largest producers in the world. And we have common interest in climate and so many other issues, many of which you'll be discussing today. I will never forget Secretary Rice's trip to Bahia, with the ambassador and I both there, when she said, "I've always believed that Brazil and the United States look more like each other than any two countries in the world. Great European, Latin, and African traditions living side by side." In fact, the CEO Forum, of which there are only two in the world, one in India and one in Brazil, for their very first meeting, established the priority of partnership. But they went beyond that, and I will quote what they said at their very first meeting. "In light of the clear shaping of economic alliances in different areas of the globe that constitute powerful competing strengths, we should build upon the strong complementary relationship between Brazil and the United States economies. The ability to bring these complementary forces together to become more effective will certainly result in strengthening the competitiveness of both countries." They went on to say that our two countries should seek the integration of our economies in a very resolute way, with the understanding that the sooner it is achieved, the better the benefits for both countries. As timely as it was 2 years ago when they said that, I would underscore its timeliness today. Certainly, we have achieved much over the last few years, increasingly because of the growing relationship between the public and private sectors, of which the CEO Forum is evidence. Today, we are seriously renegotiating a tax treaty, one that we've been trying to do for 41 years. We have a new aviation agreement opening up Brazil for Americans, but also opening up the United States for Brasileiros. And this is after 10 years of no negotiations. In November, just last month, our governments agreed to return to a 10-year visa after years of only having 5-year visas. And we're working together to eliminate additional fees for business visas and to combine the business and tourism visas. And the one thing that I am very proud of is it no longer takes 100 days in Brazil to get a visa to visit the United States. Whether it's in Sao Paulo, Rio, Brasilia, or Recife, we have reduced the wait times to weeks and sometimes only days. We have joined forces economically, and we still see increased interest in investment and even in venture capital today in Brazil. Much of our progress has happened because it is in Brazil's interest, as well as the United States, to increase our trade and investment and tourism. Brazil's own multinational companies are leading the charge. They also understand the need for an investment treaty, especially in this increasingly competitive business environment. Let us also not forget that trade and investments are not a guarantee, they are an opportunity. Returning to how Brazil can be the best of the BRICS, or as Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs said, au milieu dos BRICS. Economic investment is the foundation of a growing and prosperous economy. And I would say for Brazil to be the best of the BRICS, it must do everything it can to accomplish that. Recently, the Financial Times, in an article entitled "The BRICS," talked about private equity groups and people making investments, taking big legal and financial risks as they invest in emerging markets. Any business executive knows capital is drawn to safe investments. That means investments in countries with transparent rules of business and protection of intellectual property rights. That is why developing a framework, including investment treaties, is so important. It is especially important as Brazil climbs the economic ladder for Brazil to protect intellectual property, including trademarks and patents. It would never be in the interest of a country to suspend these rights. However, it is always the prerogative of a nation to make a decision based upon what they believe to be in their best interest. There are other opportunities for Brazil to be the best of the BRICS, especially given its strong democratic foundations and free market economy. Something very powerful when put together. In short, as Brazil and the other BRIC nations strengthen economically, politically, diplomatically, they have an unprecedented opportunity. They have the opportunity to develop a new matrix for global leadership, one in which we can all work together to find solutions to the challenges that the world community faces. An ambassador's job is to build bridges, strengthen partnerships, and also seize the moment. In spite of what many people think, Ambassador Patriota and I do not just cut ribbons and kiss babies. Today, with the change of the administration, we have an excellent opportunity to build upon our already strong foundation. Biofuels is an excellent example of one of the building blocks of our relationships. In less than 2 years, we have accomplished so much, despite all of the initial skepticism. We now have 9 countries that are part of our third country program, 31 projects. We are now cooperating in Africa as well as in the Americas, in Senegal and soon Guinea-Bissau. We have agreed to a process of harmonization of standards, and we will see the laboratories of the world working off the same standards. We are partnering in next-generation research, and only last month, our national energy labs here in the United States signed an agreement with Petrobras to work on next-generation biofuels. Together, the 2 largest producers of biofuels will make this a transformational new energy resource. Such a shift in energy resources will be every bit as dramatic as that seen when the newly industrializing world moved from wind, water, and horsepower to coal, or the shift in the 19th, 20th centuries from coal to oil. But there is much more we can do with the energy matrix. Today, as part of this program, the Brazilian Deputy Minister of Energy, Minister Zimmerman, is here, and he's following up on a recent trip to Brazil of our Deputy Secretary of Energy, Jeffrey Kupfer. His agenda yesterday at DOE included not only biofuels, but nuclear energy, oil, solar, clean coal. Today, building our biofuels cooperation, there are many important leaders in the United States that are looking beyond. Recently, Senator Lugar spoke of the importance of a regional energy compact to allow our hemisphere to grow and prosper together, with a focus on more stable and sustainable energy supplies. A bill he proposed recently called for the expansion of a strategic energy partnership with major energy producers and consumers and the creation of a hemispheric energy forum. The chairman of the United States Congressional Subcommittee in Congress on the Western Hemisphere, Eliot Engel, is also putting forward new legislation in the new Congress that will focus on some of those issues. What many of you may not know is that President-elect Obama, during his campaign, also expressed an interest in bringing together the countries of this region, the Americas, in a new energy partnership for the Americas to forge a path towards sustainable growth and clean energy. And finally, I'm sure today you'll be hearing the Brookings Institution report, which was just released. And it also talked about a hemispheric partnership that would be inclusive of many of the elements I just mentioned. Not only focused on a sustainable energy matrix, but on climate change, migration, gangs, drugs, and so many other areas that we can cooperate together. Our countries have made progress in many other areas. Defense Minister Jobim will speak later this morning after having met with Secretary Gates and our Deputy Secretary, Gordon England, yesterday. His meeting at the Pentagon builds upon the first bilateral working group between our militaries in 7 years. A key outcome of that meeting was the establishment of a bilateral working group on technology transfer, something very important to Brazil and something that we in the United States can work with Brazil on. Next year, Brazil will make a decision on how to proceed with its military aviation program, and we are hopeful that the F-18 will be part of that program, continuing to bind our two nations together commercially and militarily. Finally, the Summit of the Americas. This will probably be the first multilateral meeting that President-elect Obama will attend as president. This hemispheric organization must be a focus of our attention. The United States is supportive of all the new regional and sub-regional groups coming together to solve the problems that affect us all. But let us make sure that trying to achieve the broader issue of economic cooperation, or as our CEO Forum says, economic integration, is not forgotten. We should not allow these new regional and sub-regional groups to divide into different interest groups as we look for things that unite us in common. It is incumbent that the anchors of the North and the South work together, bilaterally and regionally, through the Summit of the Americas in April of next year. As Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, Tom Shannon, recently said, this is a relationship to which both countries need to pay close attention. This relationship will really define what happens in South America and elsewhere in the world. In conclusion, as we continue our search for ways to unleash the power of partnership, our common heritage, our shared democratic values will be the bedrock of our cooperation. We don't know what the particular areas for future cooperation between our countries will be and what innovative ideas might be developed. But we know the future of Brazil is today, and our futures and our prosperity are interdependent. This is a great time for Brazil and the United States, with limitless opportunities. It is up to all of us, government, the private sector, our private citizens, to build the bridges, create the partnerships, and seize the moment. The partnership between Brazil and the United States has strengthened from Kubitschek to Kennedy, to Cardoso and Clinton, Lula and Bush, and now Obama. Today, together, Brazil and the United States can change the course of globalization and build a better future for our next generation. Thank you very much.
I was thinking of perhaps speaking from the table, if that's allowed. And can you hear me with the microphone? Yeah. Let me start by congratulating the Woodrow Wilson Institute and Mr. Van Dusen, Paulo Sotero in particularly, for bringing together such a distinguished group of people. I'm very honored to participate in this debate today, not only with my colleague, Ambassador Sobel, but with Minister Nelson Jobim, Defense Minister, who is in his third trip to the United States this year. Actually, he was here in Washington, in Florida, and now again at a time of transition. General Enzo, Governor Blairo Maggi, several former ambassadors of the United States to Brazil, one former Brazilian ambassador to the United States, many friends in the audience. My evaluation coincides with that of Clifford Sobel. I believe we are experiencing a moment of renewal in the bilateral relationship, which is also a moment of an expanded agenda, whether one looks at the economic and trade front or the peace and security and more political, diplomatic front, social issues. This year, to give an example, we had visits to Washington, not only of President Lula, who was recently here for the G20 leaders meeting convened by President Bush, very timely initiative, by the way, but also of the head of our Congress, Congressman Arlindo Quinalha, and also our Supreme Court Justice Gilmar Mendes, the head of the judiciary. So that in itself reveals an intensification of dialogue among the three branches of government, not to speak of the many governors, senators, parliamentarians, businessmen, and others that have been keeping my agenda very busy here in Washington. I think I could perhaps give a sense of where we are today in the Brazil-U.S. relationship by quoting from Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in a recent speech. And she says, "Brazil, a regional leader, is an emerging global player, and it's looking outward as never before. And we are building a partnership, the United States and Brazil together, that will matter for decades to come in this world. A relationship that was always defined by potential is now being defined by accomplishments. And when the two largest democracies in the hemisphere cooperate to promote energy independence, the eradication of malaria in Africa, the fight against racism and intolerance, the impact can be profound." I think this paragraph encapsulates very adequately what has been the current trend. And I think it's interesting also to point out that the U.S. Congress, which has been under a majority of Democratic leadership, as we all know, for the past 2 years, now the majority will increase, of course, has been very supportive of these developments. And as we know as well, the Congress has not been supportive of every single U.S. initiative in terms of foreign policy. There are at least two manifestations that I think are worth mentioning here. The first was a resolution spontaneously adopted under Congressman Engel's sponsorship, which essentially applauds the U.S.-Brazil Memorandum on Biofuels. And more recently this year, another manifestation, another resolution adopted by consensus by the Senate, by the House Foreign Relations Committee, taking note and also applauding the joint program of action to combat racial discrimination that Secretary Rice signed in Brazil, and then she went to Bahia as well, with our Minister for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, Edson Santos. So this creates the confidence, I think, for both countries and for Brazil in particular, that as the Democratic Party seizes the White House as well, under President-elect Obama, not only do we have a solid foundation, but we actually enjoy what here would be called bipartisan support for strengthening this relationship. And I believe that there's pretty much a consensus in Brazil also that this has been a welcome development and that we should pursue this effort in the future. I might add that many were surprised initially when Presidents Lula and Bush developed a strong empathy and a capacity to build a solid dialogue. It seemed unlikely and it seemed surprising given their backgrounds and their political affiliation. So now that President Obama will be taking the White House, perhaps it would be less surprising if the two leaders develop a close dialogue. And indeed, if one looks at their first contact through a phone call a few days ago, the horizon is very promising, a very promising one. I often mention to colleagues and others in the Brazilian press that I see at least three characteristics that bring Presidents Lula and President Obama together. First of all, their campaigns have demonstrated that competence can win over prejudice. In Brazil, it is perhaps as surprising for a blue-collar worker, for a union leader to become president, as it is for an African American to have become president in the United States. Secondly, they both attribute importance and emphasis to social progress, to the social agenda, and to dealing with the less favored segments of society. So there's probably enhanced scope for cooperation on poverty eradication, on fighting hunger, not only within our region, but globally, worldwide. And third, much has been made here in the U.S. during the campaign of President Obama's intention to establish dialogues, even with leaders who don't necessarily share views or that are like-minded. And I think this is a strong characteristic also of President Lula's. President Lula is a man of dialogue, whether that involves dialogue between unions and business leaders internally in Brazil, between government and the opposition, and also worldwide with partners from similar political extraction, but also with leaders from different sides of the political spectrum. The relationship with President Bush is perhaps an example of that. So I think they will share also this predisposition for dialogue as a preferred means to solving tensions than other more coercive means. We listened recently to President-elect Obama presenting his economic team and his security and diplomatic teams. These seem to be very competent and experienced personalities. He did mention, when speaking of foreign policy, of three priorities. Non-proliferation. We hope that disarmament will also be at the top of the agenda because they must go hand in hand. He mentioned Israel and Palestine, peace in the Middle East. This is something that all of us will benefit from, and indeed we have been sustaining that without serious attempt to deal with the Middle East issue, it will be difficult to tackle the extremism that has been breeding terrorism, and we know how important that is for the United States. And he also mentioned strengthening international institutions, which is something that Brazil is very much in favor of. In fact, if one looks at the current state of the relationship on the bilateral front, there's been tremendous amount of progress. Not only is there increasing trade, increasing investment, including investment from Brazil to the United States, but also a growing number of new mechanisms. There's a CEO forum that Ambassador Sobel mentioned. There's a dialogue on economic partnership between the State Department and Itamaraty that has been producing several interesting breakthroughs in areas such as the air route increase. There is the strategic dialogue between the undersecretaries for political affairs, and now also specific dialogues on Africa and the Middle East. This is something that only started this year, 2008. But I think it's fair to say that if one looks at the more multilateral agenda, there hasn't been as much convergence. In fact, there have been disagreements in terms of what should be the role of international law, of the Security Council. It is no secret, and it won't come as a surprise to this audience, that in Brazil and in Latin America in general, there was very scant support for the intervention in Iraq, for example. There is also a sense that on other topics such as climate change, the cooperation has been less than satisfactory, so perhaps also scope for improvement here. And I think although we have been working very constructively in some multilateral fora, such as the WTO, and we hope to be able to reach an agreement on the Doha round this year, perhaps one area where we will have scope for an enhanced relationship and enhanced cooperation will be that of strengthening multilateral institutions and working more constructively within the existing ones, whether the United Nations and on a wide array of subjects. I heard recently that there's thought being given to the U.S. rejoining the Human Rights Council. This, of course, would be also most welcome. And if I could conclude just with some thoughts on what will be occupying the two next panels, which is the idea or the question of whether there is room for a strategic relationship between Brazil and the United States. I went through a little bit of a research here, and I discovered that the countries with which the United States indeed maintains strategic partnerships that are baptized as such are, I would say, as a priority, countries that are on the front line in the fight against terrorism. So Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and then you would have a second group where the strategic nature of the relationship is a declared one, but necessarily part of an agreement that also involves a host of countries in the Middle East, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, as well as several NATO members, countries in Europe, and the Republic of Korea, Romania, Turkey. It's interesting to note that these countries are not necessarily countries with which the United States has free trade agreements or very important trade or economic relations. Probably those are byproducts of this. But very clearly, I would say that the priority for defining a relationship as strategic for the United States is the peace and security criteria and, I would say, fight against terrorism. In the case of Brazil, it is slightly different. I think, as you all know, we are very deeply engaged in working towards South American integration, so no surprise that we should describe as strategic our relationship with many of our neighbors, including Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Venezuela. And more recently, we have also acquired status of strategic partner with the European Union. I think the idea here is that not only is the European Union a very important trade and economic partner, but we would also like to enhance our political dialogue with the European Union. Interestingly, when one looks at Brazil-U.S. relations, although it is not named or a strategic partnership as such, there are several manifestations that point in that direction. I found a speech by Chris McMullen, who today deals with the region here at the State Department, and he said in October 2007 that in looking ahead, there's little doubt that our foreign policy in Latin America and the wider world will be more effective with a close economic and political relationship with Brazil, that is, a strategic relationship. As a key ally in the region, we are working closely and effectively with Brazil to advance shared political objectives. More recently, Nick Burns, who was Undersecretary for Political Affairs and my counterpart when I held the same position in Brazil, actually referred to me. He said, the U.S. and Brazil are building a strategic partnership. Ambassador Patriota and I have been very much involved in this together. Well, this is something that he said spontaneously, but that is not part of a, let's say, more formal agreement to recognize this. But there are two manifestations also that I'd like to call your attention to. One of them is in the joint communique that came out of Camp David when President Lula came to the United States in March 2007. And that communique starts by saying that Presidents Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva and George W. Bush reaffirmed their commitment with a deepening of a strategic dialogue between Brazil and the U.S. So there's no question that we are dealing with strategic issues, whether it's when we look at biofuels, whether when we work together in Haiti, when we look towards Africa, when we participate, as Brazil did, in the Annapolis Conference on the Middle East. And finally, an interesting reference also to the economic agenda. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, when she came to Brasilia last March, this year, 2008, adopted a communique with Minister Celso Amorim, where they placed emphasis on the importance of the dialogue on economic partnership. And here I quote, a dialogue that allows both countries to have a strategic vision of the economic relationship and allows for the identification of opportunities for future cooperation. So perhaps we are not at a stage where we enjoy full strategic partnership, but certainly at the threshold. And I think the presence of Minister Nelson Jobim here in Washington And his discussions with Secretary of Defense Gates and other contacts indicate that one of the last areas that had been left for closer cooperation is now also being tackled. And so with these words, I think I can express my confidence that the future bodes very well for Brazil-U.S. relationship, and wish the Woodrow Wilson Center at Paulo Sotero a very profitable, productive debate today. Thank you.
I would like to invite Minister Nelson Jobim, Ambassador Tom Pickering, and my dear friend Kelly Mayman to come to the stage, and we will do this Wilson Center style. We are going to start immediately and move as fast as we can. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you, Paulo. And it's great to see a room so full of good friends and people that are interested in learning more about Brazil. It's fantastic. I'm here today to introduce two individuals that, quite frankly, don't need much introduction given their profiles, but I will give it a shot. First, Minister Jobim, who we are simply honored to have here today from Brasilia. He is one of those rare leaders who has made great success for himself in all three branches of government. The Congress, the administration, obviously, in his current role, and also the justice. Essentially having served in almost every high-profile position you can imagine in the area of the justice in Brazil, from the Supreme Court to Minister of Justice to the Electoral Court, etc., to very ably representing his state of Rio Grande do Sul as a congressman, where he not only was famous for always having a cup of chimarrão on his desk instead of coffee, but also was famous for having led the constitutional reform in Brazil that was so important and continues to be today. In short, an illustrious public servant, and we're honored to have him. To his left is Ambassador Thomas Pickering, another just amazing public servant here in the United States, one of the few having attained the rank of career ambassador, and frankly, the list of countries where he's been ambassador is so long that I will just tick through them all. Russia, India, UN, Israel, Nigeria, El Salvador, and while he's got 2 out of 4 of the BRICS, Brazil not being one of them, unfortunately, we were fortunate that when he was in the position of Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, that he actually played a critical role in really forging the strategic relationship between Brazil and the United States under the administrations of President Cardoso and President Clinton. So thanks to both of you for being here. He's now the Vice Chair of Hills and Company. I will go ahead and try to set the stage just a bit, and then pass the word to our distinguished guests. It really couldn't be a better time to discuss, I think, whether or not there is room for a strategic relationship between the United States and Brazil. I personally would tend to agree with Ambassador Patriota that, frankly, that strategic relationship already exists. I think we're well past the time of a decade ago when, the metric for, or I should say 20 years ago, when the metric for whether or not our relationship was good or not was, were we fighting over orange juice and shoes, and what was the situation with software? And things tended to get kind of just boiled down to the commercial. At this point, we're working on so many different initiatives in so many different spaces that no longer is the case. And that is a change. I think that in the latter part of the 20th century, you did tend to see a bit of the natural tensions that you see between two continental powers. You had, the United States at times taking a policy to try to isolate Brazil, and Brazil at times kind of, doing their best to go their own way and not having to deal with us that much. That reality is simply no longer the case. And really, I think, the relationship between President Bush and President Lula that's already been referenced, and the various structures and institutional dialogues that have been built around that are incredibly important and have served to deepen that further. I think that we're in a very interesting time, though, right now to build on that and to deepen that in a very meaningful way. At the same time that there is a real need globally to review our multilateral institutions to see, do they match up to the reality of today? It's been referenced in the two presentations to date. Do we have the BRICS in? Do we have the emerging markets in these institutions? And can we get those voices into the institutions in a way that does not make them unwieldy and makes these institutions still valuable and able to do their job of securing our region and our world? Those are all very, very important questions. And at the same time that really now with the global financial crisis, we have a much broader constituency of voices asking those questions. And we have a new administration here in the United States that's coming in with a real need to kind of plant its flag and show, the era of unilateralism is over. We are committed to multilateralism, and really show that through deeds and not just words. So I see that convergence as a real opportunity, and to use Paulo's word, giving real room to the possibility of continued and deeper collaboration between Brazil and the United States. I'd love to hear from our guests as far as how they see that collaboration and continuity, frankly, of the good work that's already going on in our bilateral relationship, continuing forward, and putting that against the backdrop of some of the other existing mechanisms that are out there right now. The most new being the UNASUR, and of course the minister has had a very important proposal for Security Council within UNASUR. How do we see the work that's going on in the global multilateral institutions going on one path at the same time that some of these newer institutions, such as UNASUR, are finding their voice and finding their space, sometimes at a time when there are challenges and regional complications. The situation between Brazil and Ecuador has already been mentioned. So I think hearing from our guests on that reality, on those possibilities, and what we can expect going forward would be very, very interesting. And so with that, I'm going to pass the word to the Honorable Minister Jobim.
Muito obrigado, senhora Meiman, caro companheiro de mesa, senhoras e senhores, o Cardinal Enzo, comandante do Exército, senhor embaixador do Brasil, Aguiar de Patriota, e senhor embaixador Clifford Sobel. Saúde também nosso amigo Rubem Barbosa, que foi grande embaixador brasileiro aqui em Washington. Creio que eu havia escrito, ou melhor, a minha assessoria havia escrito um texto, como de resto acontece normalmente, e, como sempre acontece, acabamos abandonando a assessoria. Eu creio que nós devemos pensar, no meu ponto de vista, ou seja, tendo em vista a minha formação e a minha forma de agir, indagar sobre a existência ou não de relações estratégicas ou não entre países, depende também, em alguns termos, discutir significado de palavras. Porque nós precisamos saber o que acontece. E sobre o que acontece é que nós podemos dizer alguma coisa. E sobre o que acontece é que nós podemos saber do que estão falando, ou qual é o uso que está sendo dado àquele tipo de palavra. Eu me recordo que, lá para os anos 90, quando se discutia a União Europeia, então os acadêmicos jurídicos adoravam discutir se aquilo era um federalismo, um novo federalismo, mas às vezes era uma grande discussão teórica importante, em termos de definição de linguagem, mas não em termos de realidade. Eu creio que a questão da possibilidade de nós mantermos relações mais aprofundadas com os Estados Unidos, seja o nome que se der, cabe-me falar sobre a área da defesa. O Brasil decidiu elaborar, e o presidente Lula determinou ao seu ministro da Justiça, elaborar um plano estratégico nacional de defesa. Por que isto? Por uma razão histórica, típica do Brasil. Os políticos brasileiros que fizeram a transição do regime militar, entre eles eu me incluía, tratavam ou consideravam o tema defesa como um tema vinculado à repressão política. E, portanto, era um tema vetado. Quem tratasse de temas de defesa era visto como um pretenso prosseguidor ou um pretenso desenvolvimentista daquilo que nós chamávamos o Conselho de Segurança Nacional. Então nós não queríamos saber disso. O Antônio Barros de Castro sabe muito bem disso. A academia brasileira, por sua vez, desprezou, ou despreza ainda, ou considera como de segunda categoria os acadêmicos que tratam do tema de defesa. A academia brasileira tem muito compromisso com a erudição e muito pouco compromisso com definições e com clareza de posições. Nós temos grandes eruditos. Grandes eruditos. Na área jurídica é impressionante. Conhecemos com absoluta perfeição o pensamento de juristas americanos, conhecemos com absoluta perfeição o pensamento de filósofos estrangeiros. O julgamento das teses acadêmicas no Brasil passa sempre para saber o que o autor leu e qual é a bibliografia do seu trabalho. Seguramente Wittgenstein não passaria nos exames da Academia Brasileira, uma vez que Wittgenstein não leu nada para escrever o Tratados Lógicos Filosóficos ou suas investigações filosóficas. O presidente Lula determinou, portanto, e percebendo esta realidade, de que o tempo mudou e que havia necessidade de que o poder civil, ou seja, o poder político, pudesse ter uma posição em relação aos temas de defesa, depois de um diálogo com nós estabelecido, designou a mim e ao ministro Mangabeira Unger para fazer uma análise do problema. E como se esperava, ou não se esperava, fizemos o primeiro contato com os generais. O primeiro contato foi com o Exército, o general Enzo e seu Estado-Maior. E fizemos algumas perguntas sobre hipóteses de emprego de forças. Monitoramento do espaço, monitoramento do território. Como é que o Exército pretende fazer isso? A pergunta queria uma resposta. E em face da resposta, será necessário ou não uma reorientação das forças brasileiras, do Exército? Terá que mudar o perfil do soldado combatente brasileiro? Quais os equipamentos que poderiam viabilizar o cumprimento dessa tarefa? Nós estávamos com esta simples questão, eram 10 ou 12 hipóteses de emprego, nós estávamos vertendo a ordem das relações do poder civil com o poder militar. O que aconteceu durante um grande período pós-transição, ou logo a seguir a transição militar? Os militares reclamavam equipamentos e o poder civil dava metade daquilo, num sentido de satisfazê-los, mas não tinha nenhuma razão, nenhuma vinculação aquela relação do poder civil com o poder militar num objetivo que fosse nacional. O primeiro encontro que tivemos com os militares foi surpreendente e, evidentemente, defensivo. Nós fomos lá, o general Enzo, com toda a sua elegância, apresentou o seu trabalho e eu mexi com eles. Mas está muito bom, então não precisa de nada. Por quê? Porque eles estavam desconfiados. Que negócio é esse de civil vir conversar sobre questões estratégicas de defesa? Porque não havia. Ou seja, nós tínhamos perdido ou tínhamos deixado um espaço que tinha que ser ocupado e foi ocupado pelos militares. Que é a definição exatamente das funções das forças na vinculação com a sociedade. E aí, depois que os militares, tanto do Exército, da Aeronáutica, perceberam isto, nós então passamos a elaborar esse plano de defesa num debate constante, leal, transparente e rigidamente duro em termos de posições. Ou seja, nós entendemos que assessorias militares só podem ser competentes, ou como de resto a maioria dos assessores, embora alguns assessorados não pensem nisso, a maioria dos assessores tem que ter a capacidade de dizer não. E que, felizmente, devam conhecer mais o tema do que os assessorados. Embora alguns de nós pretendam o contrário. O fato é que nós desenvolvemos essa temática e chegamos a 3 eixos. O primeiro eixo é a reorganização das Forças Armadas brasileiras vis-à-vis o território brasileiro. O segundo eixo é a indústria nacional de defesa. E por quê? Porque não se justifica politicamente e não tem força política alguma justificar investimentos do contribuinte brasileiro em armas num país que tem uma tradição não belicista, porque a última guerra que nos envolvemos foi a Guerra do Paraguai. E nós, como discutir com a sociedade a possibilidade de nos aparelharmos? E para que eles possam compreender que um país do mundo moderno que não disponha de uma capacidade dissuasória forte não tem a capacidade de dizer não no mundo. Tem que se submeter a que aqueles que são os primeiros do mundo possam determinar. E isso importa em imbricar o desenvolvimento nacional à defesa. E compreender que há uma recíproca dependência entre desenvolvimento e defesa, funcionando a defesa, inclusive, como um escudo para o desenvolvimento. E é por isso que nós resolvemos, na necessidade de termos parceria com países no mundo que nos viabilizem a capacitação nacional em termos de produtos de defesa. E que possamos ter investimentos tecnológicos e um desenvolvimento tecnológico no país para as suas estruturas de defesa. Esta é a razão pela qual, junto ao senhor Robert Gates, nós dissemos claramente, e aí vamos falar com clareza, o embaixador Sobel deixou claro de que os Estados Unidos têm interesse de participar no projeto FX das Forças Aéreas Brasileiras com o F-18, da Boeing. E o Brasil responde, o que vocês transferem tecnologia e o que vocês asseguram de que nós possamos desenvolver essa tecnologia no Brasil? Se esta resposta não for dada, a conversa não continua. Porque nós não nos apresentamos no mundo como compradores de produtos de defesa. O que nós queremos, meu caro Antônio Barros Castro, é fazer com que esta indústria se produza no Brasil. E nós sabemos muito bem que a indústria de defesa sempre opera no teto tecnológico. E tem uma capacidade dual de transmitir ao setor privado, civil, grandes possibilidades de desenvolvimento. E isto autoriza, então, que esta política seja uma política compartilhada com a população. Significa que se desloca a defesa como algo que estaria na agenda exclusivamente militar para se transformar a defesa algo que está na agenda nacional. E para isto, ou seja, este desenvolvimento desta agenda, está necessariamente vinculado à questão do desenvolvimento da indústria de defesa. E o desenvolvimento da indústria de defesa está na dependência de entendimentos que se fazem com os grandes centros produtores. E para isso nós temos que dois lados. Para esse desenvolvimento precisamos outorgar a esta indústria nacional de defesa algo que seja um regime jurídico, regulatório e tributário especial para assegurar que as compras públicas nesta indústria sejam regulares e não sejam interrompidas, como a história do Brasil determina. Porque toda a tradição das forças sul-americanas, inclusive, eram as compras de oportunidade. Aspas. Se descobria que os Estados Unidos ou algum país europeu já queria desativar da sua força um determinado equipamento e saímos todos correndo para comprar aquele equipamento. E depois ficávamos na dependência absoluta da manutenção que não sabíamos fazer. E não só da manutenção que não sabíamos saber, também da possibilidade de que o país de origem autorizasse a empresa produtora local de receber o que é chamado instrumentos sensíveis de defesa. Recentemente, solucionado pelo embaixador Sobel, nós tivemos um exemplo. O A-29, o supertucano brasileiro, recebe um GPS de guiamento, ou seja, instrumento de guiamento do próprio avião e do seu foco de tiro, daqui dos Estados Unidos, degradado. Isto mostra a incapacidade de nós podermos ficar nesta dependência. E por isso vamos caminhar para uma relação que seja dos Estados Unidos de absoluta transparência. Nós não temos tempo. Não temos tempo para pensarmos no aprofundamento de diálogos. Temos tempo necessário para saber o que se faz e que se pode fazer, concreta e diretamente. Porque a verdade é que há uma decisão política brasileira de formulação de sua própria agenda. Eu vejo aqui e saúdo com grande alegria o governador Blairo Maggi do Mato Grosso, que é um dos personagens do Brasil que sofre as acusações decorrentes de agendas que não são brasileiras. A Amazônia, por exemplo, tem uma agenda ecológica produzida fora do país e que nos coloca naquele conflito radicalizado que, de um lado, os preservacionistas absolutos, e que estes preservacionistas absolutos acabam empurrando uma população de mais de 20 milhões de pessoas para a ilegalidade, porque não pretendem que aquilo seja feito nada. O Brasil tem que ter a sua própria agenda para a Amazônia e para as zonas de transição da Amazônia, como é o caso do Mato Grosso, e que se vinculem ao desenvolvimento do país. Um desenvolvimento que compatibilize claramente o desenvolvimento econômico sustentado com a preservação da floresta. O Brasil sabe claramente de que a floresta amazônica é uma necessidade e um benefício do mundo. E o Brasil sabe que compete a ele preservar este espaço a bem do mundo e a bem próprio. Mas é ele que vai preservar numa política definida por ele próprio. Ou seja, não há que se pensar de que nós possamos preservar a Amazônia para o deleite de europeus que desejam ver e fazer uma espécie de parque de árvores para as suas visitas de fim de semana ou para o passeio deliciado com seus netos. A Amazônia tem 20 milhões de pessoas. E nós precisamos dar uma solução para o desenvolvimento. a essas pessoas. E vejam bem, tratar essas questões como se fossem questões criminais, nós conhecemos muito bem o que acaba sendo. Porque se você não dá uma solução econômica para essa gente vai para a ilegalidade. E vai para a ilegalidade por uma razão simples, porque tem que sobreviver. E é por isso que nós queremos formular a nossa agenda própria de desenvolvimento sustentado para a região amazônica e para também o Cerrado e o Pantanal. Porque senão, nós sabemos claramente de que a autonomia e a soberania do país fica atingida. Digo isso com clareza porque quero mostrar aos senhores que para fazer isso precisamos ter a capacidade de dizer não. E para fazer isso precisamos ter a capacidade de dissuasória em termos de defesa. E é aqui que se liga a defesa ao desenvolvimento. O diálogo que estabelecemos com os Estados Unidos é altamente importante. Realmente importante, considerando as possibilidades que temos de parcerias nesse setor. Agora, recentemente, ou melhor, em 22 de dezembro, o presidente Lula assina com o presidente Sarkozy a parceria estratégica com a França e que inclui, na área de defesa, o desenvolvimento e a produção no Brasil de um submarino de desenvolvimento nuclear, de propulsão nuclear. Ou seja, a França transmitirá a nós a tecnologia não nuclear para o submarino de propulsão nuclear. Por quê? Porque temos 4,5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados de águas jurisdicionais brasileiras no desenvolvimento do projeto LEPLAC, onde estão as grandes riquezas brasileiras. Isso tudo também nos levou ao entendimento com os países sul-americanos e à proposta da criação do Conselho de Defesa sul-americano, que não é uma aliança militar clássica do modelo do século XX. É um órgão de consulta, de entendimento, para que possamos formular no hemisfério ou no subcontinente uma identificação de uma política de defesa. Nós temos 3 vertentes fundamentais territoriais: a vertente amazônica, a vertente platina e a vertente andina. O Brasil participa de 2 delas. Na vertente amazônica participamos com a Guiana Francesa, o Suriname, a Guiana, a Venezuela, o Peru, a Colômbia, o Peru e a Bolívia. A vertente platina nós trocamos com o Paraguai, o Uruguai e a Argentina. A Bolívia dispõe das 3 vertentes, a andina, a amazônica e a platina. E tudo isso nos leva à necessidade de termos um diálogo absolutamente transparente com os nossos parceiros sul-americanos. Alguns se preocupam muito com a emergência de líderes na América do Sul qualificados de populistas. Preocupam-se muito com o presidente Chaves, preocupam-se com o presidente Evo Morales, preocupam-se com o presidente Oscar Correia. Por que será que o presidente Chaves recebeu um processo eleitoral e emergiu como líder numa zona da Venezuela ou num país como a Venezuela, cujas elites anteriores não tiveram a capacidade de formar uma classe média forte e preferiram retirar os valores do petróleo para utilizá-los em Miami ou na City em Londres e não desenvolver uma classe média que possa estruturar e estabilizar o país? O que nós temos que perceber é que essas tensões que estão passando na América do Sul são tensões decorrentes da chegada na participação das decisões do poder de uma série de personagens que haviam sido excluídos historicamente disso tudo. Precisamos lidar com isso. Não podemos impedir isto, precisamos assimilar isto e saber tratar disto, com tolerância, compreensão e visão de futuro. Nosso compromisso, portanto, minha cara presidente, meu companheiro de mesa, é que nós estamos abertos a esses entendimentos. Seja o nome que quiserem dar. Parceria estratégica, parceria meia estratégica, parceria relativamente estratégica. Isto os nossos companheiros do Itamaraty saberão tratar, porque advérbio de modo e adjetivo eles estão de uma competência absoluta. O fato é que nós vamos caminhar para isso, há possibilidades disso, os entendimentos que trouxemos ontem com o senhor secretário de Estado Robert Gates, mas num patamar distinto. Num patamar distinto e do mesmo nível. Ou seja, a América do Sul não é mais o que foi há alguns anos atrás. A parte lá de baixo da América. Não, ela está no mesmo nível da América de cima. E se a América de cima não compreender isso, não compreende o processo histórico de inclusão e o fato do multilateralismo necessário para o desenvolvimento pacífico do mundo. A paz é o nosso compromisso. A paz só se dará com o processo de inclusão global de várias pessoas no mundo que são objeto, no mais das vezes, de certas laivos de protecionismo ou de concessões de esmolas, como se essas populações precisassem de esmolas. Eles precisam de trabalho e precisam de renda. E se isto não for conseguido, no mundo moderno nós sabemos muito bem, os espaços para as rendas nas áreas urbanas é o trabalho. O trabalho no setor público, o trabalho no setor privado. E se não tem espaço aqui, vamos para um terceiro espaço, que é a economia informal, com apropriação por determinadas pessoas, necessariamente, de espaços que são públicos. É o que passa-se, por exemplo, com os chamados flanelinhas no Brasil, que cuidam do estacionamento de automóveis e que assumem um espaço público e passam a administrar aquele espaço público, obtendo renda e cobrando por aquela administração. E se não tiver este espaço, não existir, não pensem não que esses personagens vão pretender ir para um outro espaço que nós conhecemos, que são os cemitérios de todo mundo. Não, eles vão para a ilegalidade. Primeiro para a ilegalidade informal, não organizada, o furto e o roubo comum. E por último, para a ilegalidade organizada. Ou seja, a responsabilidade do aumento da ilegalidade e atos dessa natureza, inclusive de fanatismos modernos, decorre exatamente da nossa incapacidade de trazer esses personagens para um espaço democrático que lhe dê garantia de sobrevivência. Nós todos falamos com altruísmos, com absoluta tranquilidade sobre tudo, desde que não atinja a nossa família. Atingiu o filho, a coisa muda de figura. E eu vou roubar para dar alimento para ele, se for necessário. E isso é que nós precisamos compreender e criar espaços para isto. O Brasil caminha para entendimento dessa natureza, tem clareza nesse sentido, conseguimos uma estabilidade política que não tínhamos e conseguimos também algo que é importante, é de que às vezes nós gastamos um tempo imenso discutindo o passado, fazendo análise, meu caro Antônio Barros Castro, do passado, para retalhá-lo, e achando que vamos construir o futuro retalhando o passado. E perdemos uma energia imensa nisso. O que nós queremos hoje é que o Brasil, com a participação e com a colaboração dos países do mundo, inclusive dos Estados Unidos, nós possamos fazer um grande ajuste de contas com o nosso futuro e fazer com que a nossa geração possa trazer o futuro para mais próximo do presente. Muito obrigado.
Minister Jobim and distinguished Brazilian guests and ambassadors and former ambassadors and all in the audience. It's a special pleasure and indeed a high honor for me to share the platform with the Brazilian Minister of Defense and to talk to you today about a strategic relationship and what I see ahead in that relationship for the future from a peculiarly American perspective. I use the word peculiar because I come neither, as I used to do formally, as the representative of an American government, nor do I have a connection with the new administration, nor has the new administration, in a sense, actually declared itself with respect to the questions that are before it, the strategic issues of priorities and objectives. That will come. But I have the pleasure and indeed the honor of speaking for myself in this particular set of circumstances and talking to you about what one observer with a certain amount of antiquity believes to be true about the challenges that lie ahead for the next administration in the United States and how and in what way they may relate to Brazil and our emerging strategic relationship, and I indeed would venture to say strategic partnership. It is true that the blessings of strategic partnership, or indeed the attachment of the epithet, has served many purposes in American diplomacy. Some of that is flattery, some of that is cajoling, some of that is serious, and some of that is, from time to time, actually realistic. In terms of the United States and Brazil, I would like to dwell, I hope, in the theater of realism, because those are important relationships. They have meaning, and they give sense to where our two countries are going. My depth of knowledge of Brazil in detail is limited. I did and do have, Ambassador Patriota, the right to claim at least some parentage for the strategic dialogue. I think at least the most recent version of it began on my watch too many years ago to count, but I am delighted to know and understand that it continues to be important. I thought it was strong in the days when I left it, and I believed it was breaking new ground between our two countries, that we would talk on the basis of full equality about many of the serious issues that faced us both in the hemisphere and beyond. And the growth and strength of that dialogue is only one measure, I think, of where our two countries can and will go in the future. And I accept, too, your analysis of the two individuals leading our countries and the degree to which they have already, in my view, extensive overlap in their ideas and thinking about where our countries go in the future. Against that backdrop, too, I would like to refer from time to time, as I proceed ahead, to a study that was finished this week in which, at the Brookings Institution, and I think it's no crime to mention the name here at Woodrow Wilson, had 10 very distinguished figures from the hemisphere, including 3 former very distinguished presidents of countries in the hemisphere, and 10 gringos, 10 North Americans, 10 Americans, to contribute together to a study which I believe has achieved an interesting and I think unusual balance. It is not a Brookings study to tell our friends in Latin America how to behave, something that we have suffered too long by attempting. But it is an interesting study because it provides, I think, equally a view from the hemisphere about what the United States should be doing on critical questions looking ahead, and how and in what way they relate to essential interests in the hemisphere. And a former very distinguished Brazilian foreign minister helped us in the study, so it is not of devoid, if I would put it this way, of Brazilian input. I would say quite to the contrary. Let me begin by also saying that we are in a time of fantastic change in the world, that new developments over recent months and even days have made a real change in how we look at strategic objectives and priorities in this country, and I would venture to say, in all humility, in Brazil. I also think those questions then must be factored in centrally. For my own country, there are lessons learned in recent years that I think are now part of a new emerging national ethic, cultivated and cultured in the election campaign, but indeed, in my view, reflective of some of what I would call the innate wisdom of the American people, which is frequently tapped by polls. Among those points that I would raise for you that set the stage and background to the strategic objectives and indeed issues I want to talk about are the following. That unilateralism and unipolarism is not only dead, but in my view, never should have been born. Unilateralism doesn't work, and unipolarism, in my view, never existed because we never existed in a world where the interests, indeed the roles, and indeed the values of other countries were not also preeminent in our international and global intercourse. We are in a world that is much more global and will be, in my view, and always has been, very multilateral. It is a role, therefore, in which the question of international institutions is a very significant one, and it will grow. And it is a role in which diplomacy will increasingly play a role. No longer is there a view that force can shortcut diplomacy and solve in a trice the major problems of mankind in the interest of whatever country, including this one, wishes to pursue in the achievement, put it this way, of its goals. War and force are complex and difficult. They are last resorts for all of us, as Minister Jobim has pointed out, and we all are constrained to think about them, but I hope to think about them in that last resort category, while I hope we lavish time, attention, diligence, and dedication to the question of improving our ability to work together and relate to each other through diplomacy in all of its facets. I think it is also safe to say that with globalization, the issues before us have assumed a new and different character. It is a truism to say that most things in one way or another are related. But it is also true now that many of the issues that we face no longer appear comfortably in the old stovepipes in which we used to view them, in the old categories. Two things, I think, are characteristic of this change. One is that national interests are more global and therefore more expressed in words that characterize the issues not as a problem of country X or a difficulty of region Y, but in a sense, a serious question related to a global issue or two that we have now before us. And if I can hold off being more definitive, because I think it will be useful to understand the point if I say one more thing, that the interconnectedness of issues that we now have to cluster together is, in my view, both self-evident and important, but extremely valuable in thinking about strategic leveraging between issues in arriving at solutions to problems on the one hand, and avoiding unintended consequences on the other. The simple example, of course, is the question of the linkage between energy, climate change, and the environment. And here, as we deal with that set of issues, I think we can see clearly how important the interrelationships are, how significant they will be for us in the future, and how short-sighted we will be if we believe we can treat each of these individually without having a serious impact on all of the others. Having now exposed the blindingly obvious, let me struggle on to try to deal with what lies ahead, in my view, for the next administration at this particular offing. The first set of questions that I think anybody who has not been sleeping for 4 months would put at the top of the list of priorities for our country is what we used to call the financial crisis, but which is now a global macroeconomic crisis, trending for almost all of us rapidly into depression. Not the mental state, but the economic state, although the mental state will follow. The sets of issues that we have to deal with have multiplied as we have watched them, from dealing with bad paper and its impact on bad debt and over-leveraging and its downward swipe to credit crises, indeed now in this day and age, to crisis in American major industry, to rapid contagion, which matches in every sense of the word what we had imagined at least that SARS might produce if it had migrated to being rapidly multipliable in the human body. These kinds of questions now affect some of the basics of our economy in this country, and I am sorry to say, quite probably, in many others. The fact that U.S. and Brazil share a common interest in this country, in this problem, is only symbolically represented by Brazil's attendance at the G20, but in many ways totally represented by what Brazil's economy and by what America's economy are undergoing at the present time. I would say only 2 or 3 other things about this issue. The bad news from my perspective is that no one yet has come forward with a persuasive view about that series of steps that we have to undertake to find our way through this crisis, because nobody has come forward yet, in my view, with a persuasive analysis of the crisis and its full ramifications. I wish I could be more confident in front of you today that I thought that that was coming soon. But it leads, of course, to serious crises in confidence, because no one is free to say what Franklin Roosevelt said at his inauguration, because he had the ideas, the plans, and indeed the programs to deal with the crisis, that the only thing we have now to fear is fear itself. The better news is that we are moving in the direction of achieving the degree of celerity and understanding that I think is necessary. But even more, I would say that in this crisis, at least, most governments seem to be willing to take those critically difficult steps that are necessary, up to and including in this country commitments of financial sums so astronomical that if you had said 4 months ago that that would be the case in the United States, you would have been instantly locked up as loco. Hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars. The bad news in that is nobody has yet figured out precisely how we will pay for that. The other piece of good news, and it goes to our connection between Brazil and the United States in this hemisphere, is that there is, as far as I can see, a great sense of the real necessity for us to work together, even when it pinches at home. And this, in my view, too, is an important lesson we learned from the 1930s that we must carry forward. Look, if that was not enough, I want to add to it 5 other clusters of crises, just at the top of my list. The second one is geographic in the broadest possible sense. It is the cluster of issues now that I think can best be defined as the Middle East from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas, from the west coast of Israel to the eastern borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. A set of crises interrelated in the three I-word countries with what is now also going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Israel, Iraq, and Iran. That congery of questions, as the new administration has already said in the voice of President-elect Obama, is at their top of their list, and it would be, I think, at the top of anybody's list, right after the financial crisis. Brazil, in interesting ways, is a long way from the Middle East, but it was at Annapolis, as we've already heard. Brazil has a growing relationship with Iran. One would only hope that our administration will be able to take efforts to try to emulate moves in that direction. And for both of us, what happens in that far part of the world, in energy, in disruption, in relation to our minority populations that come from that part of the world, and indeed to international tranquility, are all of strategic interest and should be part of our strategic dialogue and our strategic relationship as we move ahead. That set of issues, in my view, is followed by another, defined very loosely, if not by geography, by naming a number of the countries that are important in dealing with this issue or problem. It is the question that I call potential rivals and potential partners from the perspective of Washington and the United States. And here, in no special order of priority, but maybe in rank order of troublesomeness or potential troublesomeness from Washington, I would put China and Russia, then perhaps India, maybe the EU, which is only half formed in the sense that we have to deal with it both as an entity and as a collection of states acting on their own in many cases. And I certainly would put both Brazil and Japan in this list. And that I would say, in the simplest possible terms from the American perspective, how we choose to deal with these countries, given still our preeminent military position, and despite the tragedy of the macroeconomic meltdown going on, our preeminent economic position, we will have within our power the opportunity to try to set the stage and pace for many of those relationships. That doesn't mean that this relationship across these six potential rivals or partners is dominated totally by American thinking, not at all. What it must be dominated by is American initiative to find the areas of positive common interest as a way of building that set of relationships so that the negatives which appear from time to time in different degrees of profusion in that set of relationships among the United States and these countries can be dealt with in the context of having a common sense that we can move ahead together to mutual benefit. A simple, easy diplomatic construct and strategy, but one seemingly from time to time forgotten in administration in the United States as we move ahead, in favor of the notion that we have national interests and other countries must listen to and come along with them, and that other countries somehow are born without national interests and are there, in fact, to be part of our new wave of whatever direction we're taking in whatever new reformist impulses happen to strike the United States. It is also true that we have somehow tended to forget that even in China and Russia, there is a sense for the leadership that they have to please a population what I would call the most elemental form of democracy, even in the greatest forms of autocracy. And to somehow, as we move ahead, not take those particular issues into account is, from my point of view, operating in a dead-end cul-de-sac in a world of the blind. And we must move forward. And the essence of diplomacy, in my view, with these countries and others, is to take those positions, those points of view, those ideas into account, and preeminently with our large and growing neighbor in the midst of the hemisphere, Brazil. We have many things that we can do together. We have many things we have already done together. They are not limited to commerce and defense. They are open, I hope, to some new vision. The Brookings report did two things that I thought were valuable, if somewhat risky, and potentially maybe dangerous. It pointed out, again, the blindingly obvious, that at some point down the road in dealing with critical questions of trade, the U.S. and Brazil needed to sit down and sort out their differences and decide their directions. Were we, in fact, going to have hemispheric trade relationships? Could they matter? Were they important? Could we, in effect, continue to find ways to work together at Doha? And was, in the light of the financial crisis, Doha becoming now more important to us or less? Could we build on the nexus of free trade agreements to move ahead to, further to develop the hemisphere? And a more daring idea, which came out of the hemisphere itself, was there room in the hemisphere for intensified consultations among leading countries, beginning, in my view, with the United States and Brazil, complemented perhaps by the United States and Mexico, as a kind of opportunity to develop a consensus that could grow out on attacking and indeed treating with many of the major problems that we would face both within the Western Hemisphere and out there beyond? I don't know the answer to that question. Some have proposed the formalization of this kind of web of growing consultations in something institutionally that might be called the A8. We all know that huge barriers have been erected in every foreign ministry in the hemisphere to any idea that would exclude all of the nations from participating in every critical question before them. But we do know that the pattern of diplomatic consultation over the years has meant that some of the more important countries to getting a job done, when they can find it possible to work together in planning and indeed struggling together to move that process out through the hemisphere, is not a terrible way to proceed towards success. And that might well work. Now let me turn briefly to 3 or 4 other questions that I think are of great common interest to both of us. From the United States perspective, I would begin with the issue of weapons of mass destruction. I would characterize this set of questions as disarmament and arms control, as non-proliferation. And I would, because it is, I think, self-evidently important, put terrorism in. Self-evidently important because the linkage between terrorism and weapons of mass destruction is one that I think we all need to be acutely conscious poses serious problems for us as we go down the road. It is an area in which deterrence, a traditional protection for nuclear states, does not seem to operate very well. I won't say a lot about this except to say that on these critical issues, efforts on the part of the United States and Brazil to harmonize their addressal of these questions is extremely important. Whether it is in non-proliferation or broader arms control efforts to bring stability in terms of conventional forces, or indeed in nuclear questions, particularly and preeminently, which the United States must begin to address with the Russians, in my view, very quickly. Big questions, very important. A second, and I think another very important issue, complementary in many ways to the first question that I raised, is a question that I would link up in the following terms: poverty and growth, development and assistance, food, health, water, immigration, drugs, and criminality. The linkages are there. Some of them may be stretched, but I think that if we don't begin to address this set of problems in the broadest possible context, we will not be effective in moving questions ahead. Brazil's looked at questions of food supply. Together, we are affected by health changes and can cooperate in every sense of the word. There's no question at all that Brazil's extensive work in Africa and ours are complementary in questions of poverty alleviation and further development. There's no question at all that both of us have problems of migration. This is not uniquely a U.S.-Mexican problem. And that drugs and criminality for all of us are a growing infection. Whether it began in our midst or not, it is there. On the latter, interestingly enough, the Brookings report said it is now high time for the United States to address with equal fervor the question of demand reduction as it addresses questions of supply. And I think this is an important and significant question for us. We have seen to be lax and lacking in the effort to treat with our own population, who perform the inestimable role of the magnetic attraction for the flow of drugs from outside this country inward. And indeed, the stain and indeed the disadvantage and debility that the criminalization of that kind of activity in the strict sense of that word means with respect to the growth in corruption and difficulties in our own society. So we must do as well at home in the eyes of our partners in the hemisphere as we attempt to get them to do in their own countries to deal with what is a growing common problem. Because the history is that no one who supplies drugs in the long run escapes the fact that domestic local demand also begins to drive some of the problem for them. We can go into each facet of each of these questions, but this is one in which I feel, given this particular set of questions for the United States and my sense that it is of high priority, that the two of us share that kind of common interest. And finally, to go back to another one, which is the example I gave you at the beginning, energy, climate change, and the environment. Minister Jobim has addressed some of the environmental considerations from the Brazilian perspective, and we, of course, must respect those. We are both in a changing energy environment. We have gone like a yo-yo from extensive scarcity 4 months ago to a morning on which the soothing voice of National Public Radio tells me that $25 a barrel may be in sight. The concern I have isn't $25 a barrel, and to some extent it isn't $147 a barrel. It is the yo-yo problem, running up and down the roller coaster. It's derivative, in my view, of the financial and macroeconomic question, and it's not healthy in either direction. Brazil is now, in my view, an emerging energy power. Pre-salt will come along. Certainly your own views about your own seacoast and its central strategic importance for you is extremely significant for all of us in the hemisphere. And it is your responsibility and should stay, in my view, high on your list of strategic responsibilities. But we also should move, indeed, in the direction of the Brookings report to recognize that ethanol can play a major role in the world's efforts to diversify and move ahead in different energy economies than the total and vast dependence we have on hydrocarbons at the moment, hydrocarbons at least from the soil. The Brookings report recommends get rid, gently but in many ways firmly, of the 54-cent per gallon tariff on ethanol in this country in order to promote the use of the most efficient of the production of ethanol in our own society. And at the same time, for us to get rid on subsidies for corn as fuel, because we know in the coming food crisis, the shifting of production of agriculture from its ability to sustain human souls to its ability to move human souls in automobiles is not a moral choice. And it is, in every sense of the word, important as we go ahead. I suspect we share with our friends in Brazil, in the process of dialogue, many common sense approaches. The Brookings study recommended that the two of us, along with a key core of states in the hemisphere, begin the exploration very soon of how we are going to address the question of climate change. Each of us has our own imperatives, but the ability in this hemisphere to pull together in a common approach as to how we price carbon and how we effectively implement that through cap and trade, taxation, will be significant as we go down the road and face a new series of conferences emerging at Copenhagen in the autumn of 2009 to deal with this central question. I've talked long enough, longer than I should have. I would just wind up in saying that it seems to me that if you look at our agenda for the future, and I wish that I had the wisdom and indeed the capacity to put the Brazilian agenda next to it, I don't. But if I looked at our agenda in all humility and said that this agenda is one in which we have shared common interests that so overwhelm the potential for differences, while that might be an optimistic conclusion to my report, I stand with it. I think, in fact, it is true. And I'm delighted to be here and to have had a chance to talk to you about a number of these questions that have been on my mind for some time. And I think the U.S.-Brazilian partnership is an excellent place to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that we've got time for about 15 minutes or so of questions and answers. We just ask that the questioners wait for the microphone for the translation, and please identify yourself and your affiliation. Does anyone have a question to start? Okay, great. Well, I've got a question. It's a bit provocative because I'm afraid if it's not, Paolo won't invite me back. But a question, if I may, for Minister Jobim. And I'm going to ask it in Portuguese. Senhor Ministro, só fazendo follow-up assim na conversa que o senhor tinha com respeito à Unasul e às metas para o diálogo que vai acontecer assim no Conselho de Segurança que vai ser criado dentro, só para entender um pouco mais das expectativas do senhor com respeito a como é que este assim deve funcionar, falando especificamente de alguns dos conflitos concretos que já existem, ou conflitos são uma palavra bastante forte, talvez desafios que existem atualmente na América do Sul, por exemplo, o que já foi mencionado várias vezes, essa situação atual entre Equador e o Brasil. O senhor acha que, entendendo que aquele conflito entra a ser um assunto de defesa, mas também reconhecendo que durante os últimos anos as despesas na área militar têm aumentado bastante na região e especificamente no Equador e em Venezuela. Como é que o senhor acha que essa instituição pode ser usada para este motivo? Oh, and if we could have another headset, please.
U.S.-Brazilian Strategic Partnership.
Não, eu creio que, observa, a existência do Conselho de Defesa formula-se como um órgão de consulta e de coordenação de ações comuns. Nós entendemos que esses atritos ou essas fricções que ocorrem dentro da América do Sul, nesse momento, são exatamente decorrentes da sua emergência. Só não tem atrito e não tem fricção quem está morto. Então é fundamental perceber de que tudo isso que nós estamos percebendo na América do Sul é absolutamente administrável pelos sul-americanos. E o Brasil desempenha, neste caso, um papel importante porque o Brasil não tem, por exemplo, problemas de fronteira. Nós não temos nenhuma dificuldade de fronteira. E temos propostas objetivas aos países sul-americanos para o nosso desenvolvimento econômico da América do Sul. Nós temos hoje uma colaboração com a Venezuela, altamente importante, com uma empresa brasileira que é a Embrapa, que é uma empresa produtora e de pesquisadora de produtos alimentícios e da agricultura, que está a desenvolver aquilo que os venezuelanos não têm, ou seja, a capacidade de produzir alimentos em termos de desenvolvimento, pagar um preço alto por viverem exclusivamente do petróleo. O problema hoje que vive é que nós temos que fazer uma distinção muito clara e uma percepção que, em política, nós devemos deixar muito claro que até a raiva tem que ser combinada. Porque quem não combinar a raiva em política é amador. E há algo que nós temos que compreender, certas manifestações retóricas e saber em quem se dirige. Observem a diferença fundamental do discurso jurídico com o discurso político. Um advogado, quando faz uma sustentação oral, ele está tentando convencer o destinatário do seu discurso, que é exatamente o juiz, seja lá quem for. O político, quando se dirige a um interlocutor, ele não está absolutamente interessado naquilo que o interlocutor pensa. Ele está interessado em dizer para alguém via esta interlocução. Então, a compreensão desse tipo de situação leva a uma relação que nós precisamos ser claros, de tolerância. Como disse o nosso antecessor na exposição, o companheiro de mesa, o recurso ao conflito é o último possível. E a tradição sul-americana e do Brasil é não recorrer ao conflito nunca. Mas sempre é necessário que alguém saiba que, se tiver que recorrer ao conflito, tem capacidade para tanto. E aqui é que a relação daquilo que eu estou chamando de capacidade dissuasória. Não há nenhuma possibilidade de este momento em que se vive lá uma fricção com o Equador possa ter maiores consequências. Isso se resolve na mesa. E a existência de um Conselho de Defesa que tem essa característica não de um conselho ou de uma aliança militar clássica, mas sim uma aliança, uma reunião de colaboração, de discussão e de adensamento para a formulação de uma mesma estratégia de defesa, uma mesma concepção de defesa, tendo em vista exatamente as coincidências que nós dispomos em nosso território. E lembrem-se, como ficou claro pelo nosso embaixador Pickering, que nós temos hoje uma grande produção de energia, somos uma grande reserva de energia, não só de energia dos hidrocarburetos, mas também de energia originária da agricultura sem prejuízo e sem concorrer com a alimentação, que é o etanol produzido no Brasil pela massa que se era desprezada da cana-de-açúcar. nós temos, na América do Sul, os maiores depósitos de água potável do mundo, a Amazônia e o aquífero Guarani, e dispomos de uma imensa capacidade de produção de alimentos. Isso tudo é importante, mas isto é importante em comum. E tem absoluta clareza o nosso companheiro de mesa. Não se resolve os assuntos pensando que os nossos temas sejam os únicos do mundo e esses temas sejam os temas dos outros, que foi uma tradição antiga dos Estados Unidos, de achar que suas pretensões estratégicas eram as pretensões dos mundos e que os seus valores eram os valores de todo mundo. O resultado que deu é algo que nós temos muito claro e temos que assumir como um fato, e como um fato teimoso. Volto ao Dr. Ulisses Guimarães e lembro que ele dizia o seguinte: quando nós tínhamos reuniões partidárias e alguém tentava justificar alguma coisa, ele dizia assim: escuta, não adianta, o fato é teimoso, o fato está aí, e nós temos um fato que os senhores têm que enfrentar claramente decorrente de uma história, que não vamos retalhar, mas temos que pensar no futuro, que é, digamos, a percepção do mundo em relação aos Estados Unidos. A percepção do mundo da América do Sul em relação aos Estados Unidos não é boa. Aí alguém pode dizer, mas não devia ser assim, esse é outro assunto. É justa, é injusta, não importa. E dizia o doutor Ulisses, não importa, o fato é teimoso, ele se apresenta como tal. O que nós temos que enfrentar é esse fato. E me perdoe dizer, mas eu acho que, inclusive, na América do Sul, uma das questões que pode e é necessário para recompor e iniciar um novo projeto de mudança da percepção americana no Sul é os Estados Unidos terem a lucidez de rever as suas relações com Cuba. Se não passar por isso, vai sempre ficar aquela coisa de achar que os valores americanos, que são importantes, sejam os valores de todo mundo. Isto é claro que não é assim. E os Estados Unidos já pagaram um preço muito alto por isso.
Thank you. To open the floor, yes, you sir in the back.
Okay.
Yes, this is from Minister Jobim. My name is Paul Starobin. I'm a journalist with the National Journal and Atlantic Monthly magazines, and I'm looking forward to visiting Brazil in March. You talked about the Brazilian, the deal with France on the nuclear power. Okay, I'll start again.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Minister Jobim. My name is Paul Starobin. I'm a journalist with the National Journal and Atlantic Monthly magazines here in Washington, and I'll be visiting Brazil in March. And I'm interested, you mentioned the deal with France on the nuclear power submarine, which goes to this larger question of the Brazilian Navy, the Brazilian deterrent. Can you elaborate on what is your vision of the Brazilian Navy in the years to come? I mean, the Indians have a vision of a blue water navy that is operating in the Indian Ocean, which is to some degree a reality. Is there anything like that Brazil has? I mean, how far would you extend this vision, which the nuclear power submarine will be a part of?
Veja, as marinhas no mundo têm 3 grandes tarefas estratégicas: monitoramento dos oceanos, ou das suas águas jurisdicionais, projeção de poder e negação do uso do mar. São essas 3 grandes tarefas estratégicas das marinhas no mundo. É evidente que o Brasil, hoje nós temos, em áreas jurisdicionais brasileiras, nós temos 3,5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados, que se estende num litoral de 7 mil quilômetros, em torno disto. Pois bem, essa área está sujeita a aumentar para 4,5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados, uma vez encerrado os trabalhos do DEPLAC, que é a fixação da linha externa da borda exterior da plataforma continental, que pelo direito mar pode estender as águas jurisdicionais de um país até este limite do bordo exterior da plataforma continental até 350 milhas. E nós já terminamos esse trabalho junto à ONU e vamos aumentar, portanto, as águas jurisdicionais brasileiras, considerando também as suas ilhas oceânicas, em torno de 4,5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados. A opção brasileira, no caso, não é uma opção de dar tratamento igual a essas 3 tarefas da Marinha. Porque se pensarmos em dar tratamento igual às 3 tarefas da Marinha, nós seríamos medíocres nas 3. E a decisão política do governo é dar tratamento diferenciado, mas conjunto. Ou seja, nós teríamos como prioridade a negação do uso do mar como tarefa da Marinha Brasileira, acoplado a um desenvolvimento conjunto do monitoramento e da projeção do poder. Ora, se isso é verdade, e como nós temos alguns temas historicamente postos no Brasil, que a Marinha Brasileira não era, ou tentou, no início da República, dar um golpe monárquico contra a mudança republicana, o presidente Floriano Peixoto isolou ou insulou a Marinha na Baía da Guanabara. E hoje a Força Naval Brasileira está, digamos, preso na ponte da Baía de Guanabara. O que nós queremos agora em relação a esse tema é porque, como nós temos o controle do combustível do urânio e desenvolvemos todo o enriquecimento do urânio no Brasil já controla, e nós dispomos de reservas importantes de urânio, falta-nos agora a decisão já tomada de termos um navio, um submarino de propulsão nuclear sem armamentos nucleares, para exatamente negar o uso do mar nos espaços em que nós temos grandes riquezas de hidrocarburo, que é exatamente o pré-sal. A defesa disto é importante, e lembrando bem de que o critério, e isto foi mencionado pelo nosso companheiro de mesa, de que o critério moderno é o critério de termos forças capazes e qualificadas para conflitos irregulares. A característica moderna não é conflitos convencionais. Toda vez que se pensou em preparar-se para conflitos convencionais, acabou-se encontrando enfrentamentos com conflitos irregulares, e as guerras que deveriam terminar em uma semana se estendem indefinitivamente, porque a preparação das forças são qualificadas para conflitos convencionais e não para conflitos irregulares. Então, no Brasil, o que nós queremos exatamente com a Marinha é termos a possibilidade de monitorar esses espaços. Ou seja, vamos expandir os espaços da Marinha, não só na base naval do Rio de Janeiro, mas também temos um outro ponto fundamental, que é a entrada do Rio Amazonas. Ou seja, precisamos pôr uma força naval mais próxima possível ao Rio Amazonas, que é a grande entrada do Brasil naquela região do norte. E termos também a possibilidade de uma base de submarino de propulsão nuclear que possa proteger a faixa territorial entre Vitória e Santos, naquela proximidade fundamental do Brasil. E lembre-se também de que algo também que é importante tem que ser pensado, e pouca gente fala nisso, que são exatamente as concessões já existentes para a exploração dos fundos marinhos, ou seja, dos fundos do mar internacional, que é administrado por uma comissão da ONU e que muitas vezes podem ser nada mais nada menos do que o estabelecimento de enclaves em alto mar de determinados países tentando controlar as vias de comunicação marítima. E para nós é importante esta negação do uso do mar nos espaços das águas jurisdicionais brasileiras e o controle das vias marítimas de comércio do Brasil que se estendem para a Europa. Daí a função, a necessidade desse submarino de propulsão nuclear. Lembrando bem que aí nós teríamos que agir em rede, de forma tal que a força de superfície enriqueça-se com fragatas e com navios de fiscalização ou de patrulha litorânea e de patrulha de alto mar. Ou seja, navios balanceadamente estabelecidos, uma relação entre a força de superfície da Marinha com a força submarina da Marinha. Nós desenvolveríamos a produção de Scorpiones, ou seja, de 3 submarinos convencionais de diesel, e trabalharíamos também na produção final de um submarino de propulsão nuclear, com o desenvolvimento e, digamos, industrial da nossa capacidade de enriquecimento do combustível nuclear.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that's going to have to be the last question, but please let's give a round of applause to both of our distinguished speakers.
I would like to ask you to just stay here for 1 second while the Minister, Ambassador Pickering, Ambassador Patriota, Ambassador Clifford, I would like you to exit this door here.